Hi, this is Dan Bullard, retired electronics engineer, sitting on the front deck of my houseboat again. It's a beautiful day. Okay, I want to talk real quick about a website that I found, Everything RF, and I'm about to rename it Everything Barf because these guys are really something. I found a thing on their website where they talked about harmonics. Basically, they believe harmonics are random things. I talk about harmonics a lot, but I'm going to talk about something else because I looked around Everything RF because I worked in RF. I worked in radar when I was in the Navy and never touched it after that. And minimal RF. I didn't do a lot of RF stuff, but I did some. And when I was back in college, way back when, back in 1975, I was going to college and my professor was a retired Navy chief who had retired from the U.S. Navy. He was a chief electronics technician. Okay, and that's what I became. I became an electronics technician. And he told us a story about waveguide. So, how did waveguide come about? Well, he was teaching us. He told us a lot of things because he worked in the Navy. He had a lot of experience. Early on, when he was in the Navy, he learned how waveguide was invented. And yes, it was invented. Now, you go to Everything RF and they have a whole web page where they talk about all these magical things and fairy farts and unicorn turds and all this stuff. None of that happens. Here's what Mr. Dillon told me about waveguide. It's pretty cool. So he said back in World War II, they were putting radar on ships. They had the radar going to the mast so they could have a dish that looked out at the ships, and you could target the ships while you were underway and you could see the other ships. Well, the thing was, this is before waveguide, and so what they did was they had these wires going up to the radar unit, and the wires carried the radio signals from the magnetron or whatever they used, traveling wave tube at the time, who knows. But they had these things going up to the top of the mast so they could have this dish looking out to see what was going on. Now, the problem is they had to put insulators between the wires and the mast. And so they used ceramic insulators going up the mast, and they had the wires going up the mast, and they would go up to the radar dish and they would look around and see what was going on. And it worked out pretty good. And they'd done that same thing on very shore stations. Everything worked fine. But the problem was, on a warship, what do you have on a warship that you don't have on a shore station? You have guns. And any time that they fired the guns, the mast would whip back and forth, and what's going to happen? It's going to snap all those porcelain insulators. So the ceramic insulators were fragile. So the mast would whip back and forth, and it would snap those insulators, and now suddenly the wires are shorted together and you're blowing up your magnetron or your traveling wave tube or whatever they used. So that was a real problem. So the captain would have to think about it. If he sees a ship on the horizon, should I fire at it? If I fire at it, I'm going to lose my radar, so I'll never know where he's going. I'll never know what he's up to. So the captain held off to the last minute before he fired his guns, and so that meant that, you know, if you have a weapon and you don't use it because you're afraid of losing something, it's pretty much useless. So that was a real problem. Well, Mr. Dillon told us about some guy came up with a brilliant idea. If you do any work in microwaves, you know that a quarter wavelength is at one end, if it's a short, at the other end is open. That's a really cool thing about RF. You go into really high frequencies and you get to where you get a quarter wavelength. So at one end of that length, whatever that is, 1/4 wavelength away from a dead short is also a dead open. So if you have a dead short somewhere, you have a dead open 1/4 wavelength away. So what they decided to do was they welded these quarter wavelength stubs all the way up the mast, and then welded the wires to them going up to the radar dish. So now you carry the radar signals all the way up to the mast, and those quarter wavelength stubs acted like an insulator. But when you fire the guns, because these quarter wavelength stubs were metal and not ceramic or porcelain, the mast could do this and nothing would happen. The wires wouldn't break, the porcelain insulators wouldn't break because there's no porcelain, and everything worked great. So now the captain could fire his guns and still see the enemy ships on the horizon. That worked really good. So they solved the problem of using porcelain insulators, but there was a problem. Now you had these wires going up the mast with no insulation on them, and they could be damaged by somebody coming along and, you know, leaning something in there or sticking their hand in there really bad. So you don't want to do that. So what they decided to do was, they know that a quarter wavelength away you can have another short. So what they did is they made a rail with quarter wavelength stubs on it, and they welded that to the wires going up the mast, and now that has a sheet of steel with a bunch of quarter wavelength stubs going up. And since those quarter wavelength stubs can be a continuous sheet, they basically had a sheet of steel, quarter wavelength stub, the wires, quarter wavelength stub welded to the mast. Now what do you got? You have an enclosed pipe going up the mast. You don't really need the mast, so you can just build a pipe. There are a few cases on Navy ships where there were places where you could slide the waveguide open and you could stick a probe in there to measure the signal going down the tube, right? There were guys who figured that out, and they realized they could put their pot in there. So they put their pot inside the waveguide, and when they fired up the radar, kaboom, the pot would light up, and they'd have all this pot smoke coming out of the radar. So that was a problem, but generally you didn't have to worry about it. The other thing, you had to be careful with the waveguide. You didn't want anybody messing with it. They had this guy that bosun's mate. He was told to go put these signs on the waveguide to keep people from damaging the waveguide, because if you damage the waveguide, if you distort it or pound it or beat it, you get it out of shape and it wouldn't work. It would cause reflections back into the radar, and that would increase the standing wave ratio, the SWR. You don't want that, because that causes excessive heat to be formed in the magnetron. So you don't want that. So they gave this bosun's mate all these signs, and he took them out to the waveguide, and he says, how am I going to attach these signs? Oh, I know. I'll use a drill. And he drilled a hole in the signs and put screws into it to keep the signs on there. So the sign said, don't damage the waveguide. So now this guy's drilled these holes and drove these screws in this waveguide, and when they fire up the radar, kaboom, the magnetron blows. But Mr. Dillon taught me how waveguide works. That's how waveguide works. Now you can look at all these things on waveguide and how it works, and all these, you know, the waves do this and the waves do that. But think about Mr. Dillon's story. 1/4 wavelength away from a dead short is a dead open, and 1/4 wavelength from a dead open is a dead short. So that's the way they built these waveguides. So that's how waveguide works. Now you can come up with all kinds of crazy theories, like everything RF does, or everything BARF, but that's not the way Mr. Dillon told the story. And I believe Mr. Dillon because he was there when they invented it. So I hope that was helpful. Waveguide is not magic. It seems like magic, but it's not magic. Just believe me, it's not magic. Anyway, once again, from the river, this is Dan Bullard. See ya.